Once upon a time, I dreamt of Charles Dickens. In my dream, I heard an acquaintance talking in an adjacent room, and I knew that he had just returned from a dinner at which the novelist had been present. And yet this was a dream of the present, so Dickens still lived. He could not have been more natural, my acquaintance was saying, laughing, telling stories. But the important thing is that I've actually been in the company of Charles Dickens. And at once I felt the phantom of the presence of Dickens hovering about me in the room. A beneficent presence, certainly, but one not unmixed with fearfulness or, perhaps, a kind of holy terror. I was lost in some time between the mid-19th and the late 20th centuries, and I could not speak. I was adrift between two worlds which now seemed to exist simultaneously, or rather, had become one world. And then I was in the prison, which was close to my childhood home. He was in a cell, and I knew that I had been brought here to set him free.
Hello, Dickens, Charles, yes. How are you? Like a parakeet, like a parrot.
Yet, as I watched him, he seemed very cheerful. He was chuckling about something.
She never lift her up eyes. No, he would say, her eyes up again.
My primary sensation was one of fear, that he was still alive, even as I was writing my biography of him, that he might turn and attack me. But he was still laughing and joking. Then I opened the door of the cell and set him free. He smiled, and I knew it was Charles Dickens, and that in some sense he had not died.
It's just an idea.
When you start going back to the sources of his imagination, when you start going back to the sources of his language, you enter a very strange area. And the best way I can describe it is it's rather like creating a character in a novel. And I found that when I was engaged in the actual writing of the book, I was, as it were, inhabiting Dickens's world. And I was becoming, not like Dickens, but I was becoming much more affected by him than I realized at first. You see, in a way, his life is like a sort of phantasmagoria, a sort of half-haunted house, half-fun palace, and you've got to run to keep up with him once you get inside his world.
How did you set about the job? I mean, what was your first major move?
Well, I sort of took my cue from Dickens himself. I mean, he always said the way to do anything is perseverance, habit, industry, effort, will. So I said, I'll read everything about Dickens, and I'll read everything by Dickens. That'll be my first step. Then I decided, in order to make this biography live, I should follow him week by week, month by month, if not even day by day. I wanted to find out how everything began to happen. And it was at that stage, I think, that resemblances began to appear, patterns began to appear, which helped me in my work. I began to hear him, for example, and it was rather as if the ghost of Dickens was, as it were, at my shoulder as I was writing.
Mary? Yes, we've got to be there at 5 o'clock! 5 o'clock!
A slim, trimly built figure, an oval face, eminently handsome, long silken hair and slight down whiskers. A swallow-tailed coat with a very high collar, a voluminous satin stock with a double breastpin, a crimson waistcoat.
He had exceedingly poor taste in the matter of dress. He wore a blue dress coat trimmed with a black velvet collar and gilt buttons, a flowered purple velvet vest and checkered pantaloons, while around his neck was the usual high shirt collar turned down in front, and the black silk tie loosely fastened with a gold ring.
The quickness, keenness and practical power, the eager, restless, energetic outlook on each feature. Light and motion flashed from every part of it. Mrs. Carlyle said it was as if his face was made of steel. And Leigh Hunt observed that it has the life and soul in it of 50 human beings. Nothing escaped him.
His speech was as florid as his costume. When he got up to speak, his long curly hair, his bright eyes, and his general aspect of geniality presented a delightful picture. I made some ingenious remark upon the subject to Thackeray, who blandly rejoined, "Yes, the beggar is as beautiful as a butterfly, especially about the shirt front."
Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me? I am. Who and what are you? I am the ghost of Christmas past. Long past? No! Your past. The things that you will see with me are shadows of the things that have been. They will have no consciousness of us. Rise and walk with me.
They went. The ghost and Scrooge across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a melancholy room where a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire. "The house is not quite deserted," said the ghost. "A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still." Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. Sat down and wept to see his poor, forgotten self as he had used to be. The spirit touched him on the arm and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Suddenly, a man in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window, with an axe stuck in his belt and leading an ass laden with wood by the bridle. "Why, it's Ali Baba!" Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. "It's dear old honest Ali Baba. Yes, yes, I know. One Christmas time, when yonder solitary child was left here all alone, he did come for the first time, just like that. Poor boy. Poor boy."
Reading your biography, one thing that comes out to me very decisively is that the child is father to the man. Could you elaborate on this?
Well, it was true in almost every sense about all aspects of his life. As a boy of, say, 9 or 10, when he read the story of Ali Baba, he could see Ali Baba in front of him. And then when he started writing his own novels, he could see Mr. Pickwick, he could see Sarah Gamp. It was an integral part of his being. But there's another side of it, too, which is less attractive in one sense. There's no doubt that there's a sense in which, as a young infant, he felt abandoned, and he felt betrayed, and he felt guilty for some reason. He always attached these feelings of betrayal to his mother and to his older sister. But throughout his life, he kept on feeling abandoned and betrayed by women. It's as though his infantile experience became the guiding star for the rest of his, as it were, passionate life, the rest of his sexual life. He never got over this first shock of abandonment. So what you see even in the mature Dickens, even in the Dickens of 46, 50, whatever, years old, is a shrinking, sensitive child who can never get enough love. And in that sense, the child remains a very much part of his mature persona. It's just the same way in his fiction. It's populated by sickly, ill-treated children. And however great his fame, however great his success, he never got over that feeling about himself.
Charles Dickens was born in 1812. His father worked as a clerk in the Naval Pay Office, and the young Charles was an apparently vivacious and happy boy. However, his childhood was marred by growing family debts, and he always claimed to have felt betrayed, first by his mother, who was eager to cut short his chance of an education and send him to work, and then by his older sister, Fanny, the family favorite, who was encouraged to continue her studies. By his own account, he was a solitary child who retreated into his own world.
My father had a small collection of books which kept alive my fancy and my hope of something beyond that place and time. They did me no harm. This was my only and my constant comfort. Now, when I think of it, the picture always rises in my mind of a summer evening. The boys at play in the churchyard.
And called out, "Open sesame!"
And I, sitting and reading as if for life.
The door instantly flew wide open.
Little Charles Dickens was a terrible boy to read. He was wont to spend his play hours in poring over his books or enacting to the furniture of the room the creatures he had read about.
Caskets of jewels, a store of silk stuffs and satins, rich and valuable carpets, and numerous bales of fine merchandise.
Sometimes he would say to me, "Now clear the room, we are going to have such a game." And the little boy would give recitations with great effect and with such action and such attitudes.
There never was such a goose. I don't believe there was ever such a goose cooked. I am a cripple. And it might be pleasant to remember on Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see.
Scrooge and the ghost passed on invisible. And on the threshold of the door, the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch. "What has ever got into your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha warned us late last Christmas Day by half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother!" said a girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother!" cried the two young Cratchits. "Hurrah! There's such a goose! Hurrah!" "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are!" said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her.
There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there was ever such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavour, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by the applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded, they looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch at parting. Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last.
His earliest childhood was spent at Chatham in Kent. Rural Kent remained for Dickens a pastoral dream, and he finally died in the country house that he had set his heart on as a boy, Gad's Hill Place. There is a story of Dickens and his father walking near Chatham. As they passed Gad's Hill, John Dickens told his son that if he worked hard and became successful, he might own such a house. Years later, Dickens, the famous novelist, returned to claim it. Even before he lived there, it featured in his fiction. Mr. Pickwick walked in Cobham Wood, fast by the house.
A delightful walk it was, for it was a pleasant afternoon in June, and the way lay through a deep and shady wood, cooled by the light wind which gently rustled the thick foliage, and enlivened by the songs of the birds that perched upon the boughs. The ivy and the moss crept in thick clusters over the old trees, and the soft, green turf overspread the ground like a solid mat.
In 1822, Dickens's family moved to London. At the age of 10, he was forced to leave Kent and his childhood behind. It was the beginning of his fall, a descent which broke him open to all the powers of the age.
Long miles of road then opened out before my mind, and toiling on, I saw a ragged, way-worn boy, forsaken and neglected. All too soon, the great black city cast its shadow on the waters, and its dark bridges spanned them as death spans life. And the everlastingly green gardens seemed to be left forever unregainable and far away.
I've always been haunted by London, just as Dickens was. The family move from Chatham gave Dickens his great theme, London, the great oven, Babylon. Uncertainty, poverty, dirt, squalor, interconnectedness, the rich living beside the poor, fog, mist, fever, madness, a place of crime and of punishment, prisons, executions, monsters created from the mud and crawling out of the mud. This is the London he saw as a child.
To pace the echoing stones from hour to hour, counting the dull chimes of the clocks, to watch the lights twinkling in chamber windows, to think what happy forgetfulness each house shuts in, to feel, by the wretched contrast with everything on every hand, more utterly alone and cast away than in a trackless desert. This is a kind of suffering on which the rivers of great cities close full many a time.
Mother, bury me in the open fields, anywhere but in these dreadful streets. They have killed me.
When I tread the old ground, I do not wonder that I seem to see, and pity, going on before me, an innocent, romantic boy, making his imaginative world out of such strange experiences and sordid things. Oh, Lord, yes.
Hello, my covey. What's the row?
The boy who addressed this inquiry to Oliver was about his own age, but one of the queerest-looking boys he had ever seen. He was a snub-nosed, flat-browed, common-faced boy enough, and as dirty a juvenile as one would wish to see, but he had about him all the airs and manners of a man. He was, altogether, as roistering and swaggering a young gentleman as ever stood 4'6" or less in his bluekers.
Hello, my covey. What's the row?
Said the strange young gentleman to Oliver.
I'm very hungry and tired. I've walked a long way. I've been walking for 7 days. Going to London?
Said the strange boy.
Yes. Got any lodgings? No. Money? No. Do you live in London?
Replied Oliver.
Yeah, I do. When I'm at home. Suppose you want somewhere to sleep in tonight, don't you? I do indeed. I've not slept under the roof since I left the country.
Well, don't fret your eyelids at that score, said the young gentleman. I've got to be in town tonight, and I know a respectable old gentleman as lives there will give you lodgings for nothing and never ask for the change. That is, if any gentleman he knows introduces you. And don't he know me? Oh, no, not in the least, by no means. Certainly not. What? Me?
And don't he know me? Oh, no, by no means. Certainly not unless.
We're very glad to see you, Oliver.
Said Fagin.
Dodger, you take out the sausages and throw a tub near the fire for Oliver. You're staring at my pocket handkerchiefs, eh, my dear? There are a good many of them out there. We've just looked them out, ready for the wash. Oh, that's all, Oliver. just for the wash.
If you don't take pocket handkerchiefs and watches, some other cove will.
So that the
And
cove that lose them will be all the worse, and you'll be all the worse too, and nobody half a ha'porth the better, except the chaps what gets them, and you've just as good a right to them as they have.
Oh, to be sure! To be sure, said the Jew. You see, it all lies in a nutshell. You take the Dodger's word for it. He understands the catechism of his trade. You see, Oliver, every man's his own friend. He hasn't a good one as himself in the world.
However, in a little community like ours, my dear, we have a general number one. That is, you can't consider yourself as number one without considering me, too, as the same.
Oh, and all the other young people. But, you see, we're so mixed up together and identified in our interests that it must be so.
For instance, it's your object to take care of number one, meaning yourself. But you can't take care of yourself, number one, without taking care of me.
Number one.
Number one.
When Dickens was 12, his father went bankrupt and was sent to the Marshalsea prison. The young Charles had to work in a blacking factory in order to support the family.
My work was to cover the pots of paste blacking, first with a piece of oil paper and then with a piece of blue paper, to tie them round with string and paste on each a printed label. 2 or 3 other boys were kept at similar duty, and one of them came up on the first Monday morning to show me the trick of using the string. Oh, and tying the knot. His name was Bob Fagin, and I took the liberty long afterwards of using his name in Oliver Twist. No words can express the secret agony of my soul as I sunk into this companionship. Compared these everyday associates with those of my happier childhood, and felt my early hopes of growing up to be a learned and distinguished man crushed in my breast. My whole nature was so penetrated with the grief and humiliation of such considerations that even now, famous and caressed and happy, I often forget in my dreams that I have a dear wife and children, even that I am a man, and wander desolately back to that time of my life. But whosoever goes into Marshalsea Place, turning out of Angel Court, leading to Bermondsey, will find his feet on the very paving stones of the extinct Marshalsea Jail. We'll see its narrow yard to the right and to the left, very little altered, if at all, except that the walls were lowered when the place got free. We'll look upon rooms in which the debtors lived, and will stand among the crowding ghosts of many miserable years.
This place left an indelible impression on Dickens, and it is full of ghosts for me, too. It was here I was inspired to write my first novel, The Great Fire of London. Dampness, ruin, rottenness, rats, woodworm, the smell of decay, the smell of the river, anxiety, solitude, defilement, despair, blacking, the world as a prison. This is the haunted place of Dickens's imagination.
My father was waiting for me in the lodge, and I went up to his room and cried very much. And he told me, I remember, to take warning by the Marshalsea, and to observe that if a man had £20 a year and spent £19, 19 shillings and 6pence, he would be happy. But that a shilling spent the other way would make him wretched. A prison taint was on everything there. Yet even in the shadow of that ironwork, I have seen the prison children thread the images of the intricate pattern, avoiding the dark marks, while far aslant across the city, over its jumbled roofs and through the open tracery of its church towers struck the long, bright rays, bars of the prison of this lower world.
In a way, it was a sad story, certainly as Dickens tells it, because his childhood was torn in half. It must have seemed to him as though his whole life was over. His whole genteel, tranquil, prosperous past had come to an end. Because every day the routine was the same. He'd get up in the morning, go to the prison, have breakfast with his parents, then walk what he called the Dolorous Way to the blacking factory by the river. Work there all day amongst the rats and the stench and what he thought of as common companions. And then back in the evening, back to the prison, dinner with his parents, and then off to a small room where he spent his evenings. He said many years later that he couldn't pass that area again without weeping, and you see throughout his life exactly the effect it had upon him. The blacking factory itself reappears time and time again in his fiction as a crumbling warehouse, and his novels are filled with the images of prison. In fact, the images of prison become so distinct that there are times in his work where the world itself becomes a kind of prison. Never has a writer depended so much upon his life, in one sense, to make his fiction come alive. If one goes back to the blacking factory experience itself, you see all the pressures of his childhood experience shaping the rest of his life. For example, he was a very neat, clean man, and one always assumes that it was a result of his experience in the blacking factory that he became so. It must have been very difficult to get the blacking off his hands, for example, and for the rest of his life he always showered once a day. He was always a man who needed love and applause and affection, and you sense there too the childhood in the blacking factory where he felt abandoned and betrayed and forgotten. So his life, in a sense, was determined by his past.
There are certain parallels between Dickens' own life and what we think of as one of the great patterns of Victorian life, the rise from poverty through perseverance and hard work to great success, with genius accompanying it along the way. Do you see him as emblematic of the Victorian age?
Sure. I mean, I've always believed that the definition of a genius is someone who stands in a symbolic relationship to his own time. That was true of Oscar Wilde, it was true of T.S. Eliot, and certainly true of Dickens. Because even the experiences as a child, as it were, show all the most powerful forces of the age working within him. Because here he was, a so-called genteel child, suddenly placed in manual labor, suddenly, as it were, becoming industrialized. And in that very transition, you see something of the transition from the 18th to the 19th century. But this is the genius of Dickens, was he tried to get out of that. He had a will to succeed, a will to conquer, and all that ambition, all that fiery will, all that need to triumph also seemed to me emblematic of the whole period.
The deep remembrance of the sense I had of being utterly without hope now, of the shame I felt in my position, of the misery it was to my young heart to believe that day by day what I had learned and thought and delighted in and raised my fancy and my emulation up by would pass away from me, little by little, never to be brought back any more. Cannot be written. I suffered such a bad attack of disorder that I rolled about on the floor in such excruciating pain as if there were a flaw in my own breast and it were in danger of bursting.
Mr. Tom Roker! The gentleman who had accompanied Mr. Pickwick into the prison turned sharp round to the right and led the way down a little flight of steps, through an iron gate which stood open, and up another short flight of steps into a long, narrow gallery, dirty and low and very dimly lighted by a window at each remote end. "This," said the gentleman, "this here is the whole flight." "Oh," replied Mr. Pickwick, looking down a dark and filthy staircase which appeared to lead to a range of damp and gloomy stone vaults beneath the ground.
"My friend,"
said Mr. Pickwick,
"you don't really mean to say that human beings live down in these wretched dungeons?"
"Don't I?" replied Mr. Roker, with indignant astonishment. "Why shouldn't I?"
Live? Live down there?
exclaimed Mr. Pickwick. "Live down there, yes. And die down there too. Very often."
And as he looked, so spectral did they become in the inappropriate squalor and misery through which they were seen, that he seemed to stand in company of the dead. Ghosts all. The ghost of beauty, the ghost of frivolity, the ghost of wit, the ghost of youth, the ghost of age, all waiting their dismissal from the desolate shore, all turning on him eyes that were changed by the death they had died in coming there.
But what if it were possible, after all, for Charles Dickens to enter one of his own novels, to bow his head and cross the threshold into the world which he had invented, and then to meet little Dorrit, the child of the Marshalsea, as she walked slowly away from London Bridge into the darkest reaches of the night?
Please, don't be frightened. I mean you no possible harm.
It is so dark, sir, and London is so barren and so wild.
Yes, those are my own sentiments too, I assure you. Well, shall we walk on? I often used to come here as a boy.
Why did you come here, sir?
My father. But I can tell you if I can tell anyone. My father was incarcerated in a prison close by here, in the Marshalsea.
Can that really be true, sir? But that's my story, too.
Yes, I know.
How do you know, sir? How do you know of us?
And I will tell you something else, little Dorrit. My father was released, and all was well. Just as your father will be set free in good time. I'm sure of it.
Set free at last, sir?
Yes,
Are you so sure?
I'm very sure.
Will you come and tell him yourself, sir? He'd be so glad, so glad.
But it's not the time.
Please come, sir.
But this was not the street he knew in the outer world. This was a darker and narrower thoroughfare, the shadows deeper, the noises more distinct than anything in reality. And as they walked on, he began to see shapes of various people, crossing, recrossing, crossing again, in front of the flaring oil lamps.
Covetous, avaricious, insatiable old face. Christmas? If the ladies will allow me to take so great a liberty.
Under the impression that your peregrinations in this metropolis have not as yet been extensive, and that you might have some difficulty in penetrating the arcana of the modern Babylon and the direction of
A
the
little frightened now, for I have lost my road.
You are welcome to the Marshalsea, sir. I have welcomed many gentlemen to
Here we are, sir. The house of my father, and of your father. Do come in, sir. Do come in.
No. I must go at once, before I'm imprisoned in another sense.
But the street was now completely dark, and he could see no one in front of him. He could not even see the outline of his own body. It was as if he were floating, floating in a dark place, waiting once more to be born. How did he do it? His energy was prodigious, like the energy and momentum of his period. He created 2,000 characters, many of whom will live forever. He wrote often 2 novels simultaneously. He made speeches, did readings, acted in amateur theatricals, walked sometimes 20 miles in an afternoon. How did he shape his working day?
No city clerk was ever more methodical or orderly than he. No humdrum, monotonous, conventional task could ever have been discharged with more punctuality.
He arose from his bed at 7, breakfasted at 8, and shortly after 9 o'clock he was ensconced in his study, where he remained till 2. Then he walked until 5 through the countryside or through the streets of London. He dined at 6. Afterwards he spent the evening with family or friends and retired at midnight.
Order was of extreme importance to him, and he had a nervous habit of placing chairs and tables in precisely the right position before he could get down to a day's work.
He always had a superstitious habit of turning his desk in a north-south direction, since he maintained that he could not write with it in any other position. And he backed up his objections by arguments about earth currents and positive and negative electricity.
He used a goose quill pen with blue or occasionally black ink. He wrote on blue-grey slips of paper, 8 3/4 inches by 7 1/4 inch. On an ordinary day, he would complete approximately 2,000 words, some 2 to 2.5 slips. But when he was writing in a furious vein, he might cover 4 slips and complete almost 4,000 words. Sometimes, of course, nothing came at all, and yet he stayed in his study, keeping to his hours. On these occasions, he might draw figures or dots, or he might doodle or play with the objects habitually on his desk. Or sometimes he would simply stare out of the window.
But I always sit there for that certain time. Always.
I have frequently told you that my composition is peculiar. I can never write with effect, especially in the serious way, until I have become so excited with my subject that I cannot leave off, exchanging all sorts of things that present themselves to my fancy, coming in such crowds.
I have often and often heard him complain that he could not get the people of his imagination to do what he wanted, and that they would insist on working out their histories in their way and not his. I can very well remember his describing their flocking round the table in the quiet hours of a summer morning, each one of them claiming and demanding personal attention. The children of his brain were much more real to him at times than we were.
Bill! Dear Bill! You cannot have the heart to kill me!
Look here. Here's the jolly life. What's the odds where it comes from? Here, catch hold. There's plenty more where they come
Now, what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life, like nothing else.
Oh, bless us. Everyone they bid you take their advice on all matters, especially the Dodgers, my dear. He'll be a great man himself, and will make you one too.
If you don't take pocket handkerchiefs and watches, some other cove will.
You might think it, but Sloppy is a beautiful reader of a newspaper. Even the police, in different voices.
Well, originally entitled The Wasteland, he do the police in different voices. I took that line from our mutual friend.
You did not take it, dear Tom. You rescued it.
I was perpetually being accused of stealing work from other writers, but I did so without realizing it at the time.
That, my dear, is the definition of inspiration.
What precisely do you mean by inspiration?
Explanations are always misunderstood, but I will give you my career as an example. I went from poetry to prose and then to drama. And after that, I went to prison.
Yet it was there you began to dream. What do any of us do but return hopelessly to the past? It is a part of us that creates our music.
Yes. And yet you were so prodigal with your genius that you attached the names of others to it.
Literature can reveal the true shape of the world, and thus of its maker.
But how can you say that? You, of all people, who made the world laugh with Mrs. Gamp and Quilp. In my lifetime, you were remembered for your grotesquerie and not for your sanity, for your caricature and not for your truth. That was the reason I admired you, even though I pretended not to do so. And you see, now I am defending you at the cost of your reputation.
I do not understand you. There were no, what was your word?
Grotesqueries?
Grotesqueries. There's no caricature. You see, all writing is a form of revelation by which we can move into that shadowy world and borrow from there emblems and images which comprehend our own state. Now, if William Blake were here...
He'll be joining us shortly.
Yes, if William Blake were here, he would see that this shadowy world was as real as the world in which I moved. I saw it all. I copied faithfully the reality. It was my vision.
In his day, Dickens is regarded as a very audacious realist, but since the time of Oscar Wilde, he's often been regarded as a cartoonist. Which do you think is truer?
Well, in a way, he was both. He always was both. When he began his career, he was known as, or thought of as a realist, because he was the first writer to invent what you might call the lower middle class. They'd never been put into fiction before, and it came as something as a revelation. But he was also, very soon after that, I mean, within like 5 or 6 years of his first novel, he was also being accused of being, not a cartoonist exactly, but of exaggerating everything. They said he couldn't create real characters, that he was too prone to melodrama, that he was too prone to caricature, and too prone to exaggeration. I don't think any novelist has suffered so much critical vituperation in his lifetime as Dickens did. If I had to sum it up in a sort of neat phrase, I'd say he was the last of the great 18th century novelists and the first of the great symbolic novelists. And in the equilibrium between these two epochs, as it were, his genius was formed. I know people talk about magic realism as though it were a recent invention, but Dickens himself epitomizes magic realism. In one way, his was a very personal vision, but it was one which encompassed the whole world, in fact, changed the whole world. He's as English as Austen and Trollope, but he's also as English as Blake and Turner. And it's that very quality which I've tried to bring out in my biography, because in a sense, when one talks of someone like Dostoevsky representing the soul of the Russian people, but I think Dickens, in a very real sense, represents the soul of the English people.
In your biography, you've included a lot of imaginary scenes, meetings between Dickens and his characters, a meeting between Dickens and yourself, and there's even one scene in which you meet an unnamed interviewer. Why have you done this?
I think one of the reasons I wanted to do it, if I would try and look at it coldly and dispassionately, is that I've got rather tired of the conventional framework of biography anyway. I wanted to push the boundaries forward a bit, as it were, to change the form, do something different. Because it's a silly thing to say, perhaps, but the mask of objectivity which a biography carries is a very false one. Because I was always aware of the latent fictional elements in any work of biography, I think one part of my brain wanted to bring them out into the open, you know, to make the unconscious conscious.
Stop. Can you stop, please? Can you tell me where you're going?
Where am I going? Where am I going? Why, that's a very nice question. Lord, yes, very nice one. I'll tell you where. I'm going forward. I've been going forward ever since I began. Ever since I began the world.
We walked beside several decaying houses along this unlit and unpaved road. And as he passed each one, Dickens peered inside.
Ah.
It was as if in these coarse dwellings, he saw some part of his own self.
I knew this place as a boy. It was a pie shop. Betty's, it was called.
You remember so much.
Oh, I remember everything. Even the smells. It's always the smells that bring back the truest memory. I was just thinking what that child said when she stood behind you.
There wasn't a child.
Oh, she came up behind you when you first started to talk to me. She said,
Does your mother know
you're
you're
out? Nothing like a street child to see the comedy in life. Even here. Yes, a child. No home should be without one. Excellent in novels, too. No, really. Especially mine.
And I could have sworn that when he turned towards me, he actually winked. A brief, funny wink. Although it might have been a trick of the waning light.
man whose vista is always stopped up by the image of himself. Looks down a long walk and can't see round himself, or over himself, or beyond himself. Is always blocking up his own way. Would be such a good thing for him if he could knock himself down. Fog up the river, where it flows among green aits and meadows. Fog down the river, where it rolls defiled among the tiers of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city. Fog on the Essex marshes, fog on the Kentish heights, fog creeping into the cabooses of collier brigs, fog lying out in the yards and hovering in the rigging of great ships, fog drooping on the gunwales of barges and small boats, fog in the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners wheezing by the firesides of their wards, fog in the stem and bowl of the afternoon pipe of the wrathful skipper down in his close cabin, fog cruelly pinching the toes and fingers of his shivering little prentice boy on deck. Chance people on the bridges peeping over the parapets into a nether sky of fog, with fog all round them, as if they were up in a balloon and hanging in the misty clouds.
If I couldn't walk fast and far, I should just explode and perish.
Why this sense of emptiness of failure you seem to carry with you everywhere?
I seem always to be looking for something I've not found in life. A vague, unhappy loss or want of something seems to overshadow me like a cloud. Now, when I fall into low spirits, which is often, a sense comes crushing on me as of one happiness I've missed in life, and of one friend and companion I've never made.
But you are the most successful novelist in the world.
You see a man incapable of his own happiness. A man always in pursuit of happiness. Now, where's happiness to be found? Well, surely not everywhere. A misplaced and mismarried man, always playing hide and seek with the world, and never finding what fortune seems to have hidden where he was born.
It's very strange to see you like this, because every time I've seen you with other people, you've been very happy, cheerful, gay, sociable. It never seems to falter, that mood, when you're with other people.
People have often talked about my energy and my magnetism and so forth and all that. What is essential to remember is that is only sustained by being kept up perpetually. If you stop it, you can go down very rapidly, which is what the books are involved with, notwithstanding the fact that there's also, to some degree, an attempt at, how shall we say, entertaining on a deeper level.
Our love and fellowship began in childhood, when life was all before us, and will be resumed when we are but children at the last. Calling softly to her as he went, he stole into the room. She was dead. There, upon her little bed, she lay at rest. The solemn stillness was no marvel now. She was dead. No sleep so beautiful and calm, so free from trace of pain, so fair to look upon. She seemed a creature fresh from the hand of God and waiting for the breath of life, not one who had lived and suffered death. Her couch was dressed with here and there some winter berries and green leaves gathered in a spot she had been used to favor. When I die, put near me something that has loved the light and had the sky above it always. Those were her words. She was dead. A little bird, a poor, slight thing, the pressure of a finger
would have crushed was stirring nimbly in its cage, and the strong heart of its child mistress was mute and motionless forever.
In 1837, the death of his wife's sister, Mary Hogarth, at the age of 17, caused Dickens a grief so intense that it represented the most powerful sense of loss and pain he was ever to experience. It stayed with him all his life. In his mood of obsessive grief, amounting almost to hysteria, we sense the essential strangeness of the man. He took a ring off her finger and kept it on his own. He kept her clothes and continually expressed a wish to be buried in the same grave as her. "Thank God she died in my arms," he said just after her death, and the very last words she whispered were of me. The death of Mary Hogarth affected him for the rest of his life. Not only did he recreate her in all his fictional heroines, but even more importantly, perhaps, he sought her image in the women he came to know. Most importantly, in Ellen Ternan. She was a young woman whom he met when he was in his early 40s, and she changed his life forever. He abandoned his wife as a result of his relationship with her. He quarreled with his closest friends and became a much more embittered, secretive, and private man. Now, it's always been assumed that Ellen Ternan was his mistress, but the reality is much more extraordinary than that. The point about Dickens is that he recreated the world in terms of his vision, or in terms of his fantasies, and it seems that in his relationship with Ellen Ternan, he recreated one of his most enduring fictional fantasies, that of a sexless marriage with a young, idealized virgin. He was haunted by her, obsessed by her, possessed by her. All the images of his fiction were recreated in his own life. He was a genius, in a sense, who held on to his ideal against all the odds. And yet, when he did so, what did that ideal conceal? Did it conceal his original feelings of resentment and even bitterness against his mother and against his sister? Did it even conceal his vindictiveness against women in general, a vindictiveness which came up to full fury in his account of the murder of Nancy by Bill Sikes? This became the great climax to his career as a public reader. He performed it obsessively, rehearsing and repeating it literally hundreds of times. It was the opinion of many of his contemporaries that the effort of performing Sikes and Nancy eventually killed him.
The girl was lying, half-dressed upon the bed. He had roused her from sleep, for she raised herself with a hurried and startled look. Get up. It is you, Bill. Get up. Seeing the faint light of early day without, the girl rose to undraw the curtain. Let it be. There's light enough for what I've got to do. Bill, why'd you look at me like that? The robber regarded her for a few seconds with dilated nostrils and heaving breast. Then, grasping her by the head and throat, he dragged her into the middle of the room and placed his heavy hand upon her mouth. Dear Bill, you cannot have the heart to kill me. Ah, for God's sake! For your own! For mine! Oh, you stop before you spill my blood! I've been true to you upon my guilty soul, I have! The housebreaker freed one arm and grasped his pistol, and he beat it twice upon the upturned face that almost touched his own. She staggered and fell, but raising herself on her knees, she drew from her bosom a white handkerchief, and holding it up towards heaven, breathed one prayer for mercy to her Maker. Oh, yes. It was a ghastly sight to look upon. The murderer,
staggering backward to the wall and shutting out the sight with his hand, seized a heavy club and struck her down. Bang! The bright sun burst upon the crowded city in clear and radiant glory. Through costly colored glass and paper-mended window, through cathedral dome and rotten crevice, it shed its equal ray. It lighted up the room where the murdered woman lay. Oh, it did. We tried to shut it out, but it would stream in. If the sight had been a ghastly one in the dull morning, what was it now in all that brilliant light? As he gradually left the town behind him all that day and plunged that night into the solitude and darkness of the country, he was haunted by the ghastly figure following at his heels. You could hear its garments rustle in the leaves, and every breath of wind came laden with that last low cry. Borne on one slow, melancholy air that never rose or fell. At times he turned to beat this phantom off, though it should look him dead. But the hair rose on his head, and his blood stood still, for it had turned with him and was behind him again. He leaned his back against the bank. He felt that it stood above him. Yes, visibly, out against the cold night sky. He threw himself upon his back. Sweet Jesus! At his head it stood, silent, erect, and still. A human gravestone with its epitaph in blood.
Everyone agreed he looked older than his 58 years. Those who had not seen him for some time were shocked by the lines on his face and the sparseness of his hair. He burned all his letters, basketfuls of them, from Carlyle, Thackeray, Tennyson, Collins, George Eliot. And as he completed the sacrificial pyre, it began to rain very heavily.
I suspect my correspondence of having overcast the heavens. A brilliant morning. Changes of glorious light from moving boughs, songs of birds, scents from gardens, woods and fields, or rather, from the one great garden of the whole cultivated island in its yielding time, penetrate into the cathedral, subdue its earthy odor, and preach the resurrection and the life. The cold stone tombs of centuries ago grow warm, and flecks of brightness dart into the sternest marble corners of the building, fluttering there like wings.
That was his last writing. It was as though his life had come full circle, back to the sunny skies and light of his youth, as though everything between had been a dream.
And as I draw closer and closer to the end, I travel in the circle, nearer and nearer, to the beginning. This is like what I read in narratives of escape from prison. With a little track of the fugitives in the night, all seems to take the shape of the great round world on which they wander.
Do you think, in the end, you understand Dickens?
Well, when I was writing it, I thought I understood him because it was as if he was at my elbow, as it were, urging me onwards. When I'd finished the book, when it had become like a finished object, it was much more an independent thing, and I looked at it much more dispassionately. Now I'm not sure at all. I think only the reader can decide if I've understood Dickens.
Having written this biography, what's your assessment of Dickens as a novelist?
He's without doubt the greatest novelist in the English language. He's what Oscar Wilde used to call a lord of language, right? I would say, with the exception of Shakespeare, is the greatest writer in the language. In fact, he can really only be compared with Shakespeare, or to use another example, someone like Mozart. This astounding energy of invention, this impossible ambition, this impossible will, this ability to create the whole time. To create a world which is a self-contained world, a self-sustained world, but also one which actually changed the way we see our world. And in his lifetime, he wrote 50 novels which will last as long as the English language itself will last. Bleak House, Our Mutual Friend, Little Dorrit, Mystery of Edwin Drood, Oliver Twist, Pickwick Papers, Nicholas Nickleby. In those novels, he created characters who will live as long as the English language lives. Oliver Twist, Mr. Micawber, Miss Havisham, Tiny Tim, Scrooge. I mean, there's endless list of them, some 2,000 in all. I think it's that inexhaustibility of his genius and the variety of his genius which mark him out as the preeminent prose writer of our country. Charles Dickens collapsed on the afternoon of the 8th of June, 1870. The servants brought a couch down on which he was placed. His family watched him through the night, taking it in turns to put hot bricks against his feet, which were now so cold. Yet he did not move at all. And can we see them now, the ghosts of Dickens's imagination, hovering around him as he approaches his own death? Ebenezer Scrooge, Little Nell, Little Dorrit, Mr. Pickwick, Quilp, Bumble, Pip, Magwitch, Fagin, Mrs. Gamp, Nicholas Nickleby, Uriah Heep, Pecksniff, Micawber, Sykes, Nancy, the Artful Dodger, David Copperfield, Miss Havisham, Mr. Gradgrind, Smike, Edwin Drood, all of them now hovering around their creator as his life came to an end. And then at 5 minutes before 6 in the evening, his breathing suddenly diminished and he began to sob. A tear rose to his eye and trickled down his cheek. He was dead. Charles Dickens had left the world.